task B.
Yeah.
Do you recommend just writing a creative fictional story, or do you recommending writing some part of story, first paragraph, and then reflecting personally and socially later on?
I'm going to wrap this up, by the way, not now, but soonish, because I'm going to spend the whole night here. But I don't have anything specific. Cool. To answer that, that's going to be a long form answer. Okay, so that question is essentially the same thing we went through, but we were just going through that for task A. The exact same logic, but a different way of looking at it applies for task B, which is, I'm not giving, so can I assume that you know how I've said to do task Bs, or how I do task Bs? Are you familiar with that from the blog?
Yes.
So I don't give that as a prescription in the sense of do this because it's high scoring. I do it because it's the obvious thing to do when you think about it, which is to say, oh, I did say earlier that if I have a point or opinion on something, I could arrive at that point through acknowledging that the broader scope that it exists in and, you know, chunking down and so on. So that's one way. A task B way is, well, okay, I have an opinion. I don't know why this came up, but let's just use cheating as an example. All right. So my wife cheated on me, ex-wife. That's not why we broke up, but anyway, that's the same story. Let's say I have an opinion well, I mean, I did have a less mature opinion then, and now I have a more mature opinion now, right? So generally my task Bs begin with a thought that I had before that was incorrect or in some way unrefined, and then the thought that I now have from maturity. The reason for the existence of a narrative is not just to make something up that sounds flowery. The reason is, let's say my initial point about that was that women can't be trusted, right? Which was the instinct reaction, right? That's a kind of a rational thing to, well, it's not well, no, it is irrational, an irrational point to have, and not one that you would want to present as your position in the GAMSAT if you want to be a doctor, right? But that was what was there for me at the time, right? If I just come out the gates and say, hey guys, women can't be trusted, I'm going to sound like a psychopath, right? However, if I explain to you how I arrived at that point in a way that you understood where I was coming from, then you can get a sense of empathy with it, which will earn me with you enough breathing room or space to get a chance to say, for you not to make that initial first impression, and to give me a chance to then reflect and show you how I grew on it, right? Now, if I'm going to show you how my logic worked, I'm probably not going to get far with you by just like giving you some logical exposition, and there isn't one anyway because it's rational, right? A lot of the things we think are irrational that are immature, right? So it kind of makes sense, doesn't it, that if I'm not going to do it through task A and I wish to do it through a story, which I would do in this case because I'm going to be able to connect with you easier that way. It makes sense then to be descriptive, right? Because the more I describe, I'll give you an example. I knew someone was lying to me. Alarm bells went off in my head. I couldn't sleep without hearing them. She kept saying nothing was wrong. And I spent a good deal of the time thinking that maybe it was just me, but then I knew someone was lying to me. I'd go about my day and come home, but something always just felt a little off place. An overhang of uncertainty and not quite dangerousness, but trouble lurked around every corner I seemed to move around. I just knew it. Someone was lying to me. I've given, through a variety of stylistic devices there, repetition, figurative language, I've given you now an insight I've connected with you now, and we're on the same page, and I've shown emotional intelligence. And so now I have permission to say, well, I wasn't wrong. She was. And at the time I made that mean that women can't be trusted. that's a very different way of arriving at my essential point. Now, that's not my point. Obviously, it's going to grow because it's a task bit, right? But you can see then that I'm not just saying go and write creative writing and write fancily because it's fun and it's engaging and here's a creative faculty. Like that is something. Yes, you're going to get points for showing that you have that faculty, right? But I'm doing it for a purpose. The whole reason that I gave the narrative was to be able to arrive at a point, or well, hold on. It's a setup. So the reason that I gave that to you was to show you the point that or my reasoning for having the point that I had. My next paragraph, I'm obviously not just going to leave you with that, a story, like a depressing story. And then I'm not saying be depressing. Please don't. It's a really bad idea with GAMSAT. I don't think I delivered that in a depressing way though. So I set up a narrative, I make it necessarily descriptive so you can follow, and then we arrive at my initial point. But I have an excuse for having it now because you empathize with me, right? Now I've got an opportunity to go, well, okay, many years on, after the psychologist and the healing, I reflect back and I see that to arrive at conclusions about the way people are or women are based on a limited sample size of information is problematic and at worst dangerous. While at the time it's not unreasonable to have had a knee-jerk reaction like that given the disintegration of the foundation of marriage, it is incumbent on us all to take steps to reflect on our lives and rash assumptions about people based on situations and ensure that they are with the way or the type of people that we want to be in the world, right? So that's a bit of, so now I've gone maturity. Okay, so I've shown, look, I had this point that women can't be trusted. I'll have to run. No worries, Mel, all good. If you need anything, just email me. Cool. Now I've arrived at this other thing of saying, okay, well, look, you can't make assumptions on people based on limited sample size. It's one person, it's one situation. There's a necessary degree of objectivity that's needed here. Okay, so now you see maturity. Now I'll go into her point of view. As I reflect further, I consider that perhaps her behaviour didn't arise out of an intrinsic lack of untrustworthiness or maliciousness, but indeed an unknown, an entirely different set of relationship pressures and expectations and hopes that she had that drove her to feel that it was necessary to express herself or be seen or heard through a format that, while through the lens of commitments and marriage vows, is not the right thing to do in an absolute sense, isn't either right or wrong. It was just a decision that had associated consequences. Of course, not being her or a woman, I can't say with certainty what drove that behaviour. However, it's obvious to me as I write that the lack of my ability to empathise with her being a woman or a wife, and I'm a man and a husband, is the degree to which my sympathy is necessitated. If I am to remain connected with people who are dissimilar to me in these respects. Indeed, had that acknowledgement of the lack of my ability, or indeed perhaps it was my lack of ability to empathise with her as a woman that drove her to that behaviour. Who can know? Right? So now I've given you the immature point that I had, but I've told you I use figurative language not because it's as a prescription. It's what I needed to do to get you to understand how I arrived at that initial conclusion. The reason I gave you that initial conclusion was to set up an ability to reflect backwards on it. As I reflect backwards, the whole purpose of reflecting backwards is because the whole point of this was to arrive at the point of you can't make conclusions based on limited sample sizes. And the degree to which you fail or are unwilling to attenuate your reflex to do so is the degree to which some of the most destructive aspects of the human ego are enabled and perpetuated. So that's the essential point that I wanted to arrive at. Don't make conclusions with limited sample sizes. And if you're not willing to do that, as in don't do that, then you're going to enable the most destructive aspects of humanity. In this case, the loss of my marriage, right? So I wanted to get to that. And by the way, that point would be my essential insight or my opinion on whatever the prompt was. To get to that point, though, I needed to explain what my point was before, but then cushion it with showing you how I arrived at it. Then I reflected back to get to a point. Then I've shown a willingness to go into the antagonist's shoes and see things from their point of view and acknowledge the limits to my empathy and acknowledge that then necessitates my sympathy. And then I arrive at this point. So it's all a setup, but the job's not done. After that, then I go, well, hold up. I've arrived at this point, but I arrived at this point from my limited set of experiences. So I can't be sure that it's actually a true point, right? I wonder if it's elsewhere in society. Let's have a look. As I look more broadly in society, I consider that this is not a behavior that's unique to myself. Indeed, Trump during the North Korean missile crisis is a paragon of somebody making a decision, or both of them paragons of making conclusions about each other based on a war of words and limited sample size of interactions, ultimately threatening the health and well-being and livelihood of both countries. And ironically, in humorously ending in some quasi-jock-type understanding between the two. And what better example of the fact that their initial first impressions of each other, had they not have been attenuated and worked through resolving an ultimate partnership, could have been incredibly destructive to humanity. So it appears that this feature of my personality or history is not unique to me, but indeed exists more broadly in society. So I've taken it, now I've gone, so I have a thought, which I arrived at from a wrong thought, so I'm showing growth. I've explained to you how I arrived at that first thing in a way that you'll empathize with me, and that's why it was descriptive in that way. Then I reflected back to tell you now what the actual point was, reflect from the other person's point of view, and I go, well, I wonder if this is just me. I go, well, actually, hey, no, this is history. And hey, there's this philosopher that said this thing about that. Maybe this isn't just me. Maybe my life experience is a microcosm of the essential human life experience. And then it ends with, well, okay, cool. So now I've found that there is something in me. I've noticed it in humanity, but still can't even be sure about anything. Even the greatest scientists in the world express confidence intervals and errors in their work. So that's why in the conclusion, I go into that thing of well, look, I seem to have a reasonable case for this, but there might be other views of your ability to, I don't know, eyeball someone or benefits to thinking quickly. We necessarily need to make quick judgments about people in order to be effective in the world that we're in. They're going to be wrong a certain amount of the times, and other times it's going to be helpful to us. But I'm having an argument. You think that, I think that, that's fine. Although we can agree, at least on the importance of examining situations in our past that were destructive and working to distill lessons from that so that we can avoid them in the future. So I expressed the confidence intervals. I considered what other people might say. And I said, well, we don't need to argue because we both agree on this thing. And so I've cohered two people that have different views into a unified viewpoint. I found a way that the two people who might want to argue don't need to because we both agree that we should look in our past. And then I close it like Chopin does with that final chord and let it linger with a hook, and that's that. So my point is that I'm not saying do this because it's high scoring. It all it logically flows of like, I'm not just going to tell you, assuming that you do want to say a point and how you arrive at it, is in the sense that, you said to me, reflect from maturity and reflect from society. So if it is the case that you want to do some reflecting from maturity, well, you need to give what you originally thought. And if you can do that, you need to explain how you got there, so you sound like a psychopath. And if you can do that, it makes sense to then say what you now think. And then I'm just embellishing that with saying, well, it doesn't hurt to consider what other people think as well. And then it makes sense to be like, well, once you're there, you're like, okay, well, that's interesting. I wonder if it's elsewhere. That makes sense. And then you consider that. And I'm just saying you can't be right on everything. So have a look. Are you? Are you not? I don't know. Anyway, I'm tired. I've had enough of this. Love you all dearly. Does anyone else have a question?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Does anyone else have a question for me?